the intent of this session really is around just getting a little bit of insight and sharing to the general public, particularly those that are interested in Ab Initio training. And in essence, your speaking around, or your session at APATS this year is around from training provider to pilot supply system, integrating CBTA from Ab Initio to airline operations. Now, the core argument that you're putting to the industry is that we're undergoing a structural shift driven by experience compression, two key words that you're using, with pilots in some markets reaching command significantly faster than in historical pasts. As a result, traditional assumptions we need to challenge, where experience is accumulated through line operations over time, effectively doesn't hold anymore. So we're going to talk through that and give a little bit more flavour to the session that you're going to be speaking at. So can you describe a fundamental shift in pilot training driven by experience compression? What's the change in the industry and why does it matter now?
Hey, Adrian, I was driven to this topic because I could see over the last decade or so, my work with an airline and then with the training provider, that the time to command for many airlines in the APAC region, and not just low-cost carriers, but legacy carriers too, was reducing rapidly from when it used to be the norm to take around 10 years to go from the right seat to the left seat to, in some cases today, to go from a 200-hour first officer to a captain left-hand seat in an Airbus 320 in as little as 4 years. And the growth is not slowing down. We can't imagine we'll see airlines not take on airplanes they've placed to the order books. So the natural question to ask then is how can we do this safely while compressing the time it took for us to gain this exposure, the exposure through sitting in the right-hand seat and watching people do it right and wrong. It took 10 years. We now have 4 years. So how are we going to get those experiences in a structured fashion built into the training curriculum? Why should we wait until they get into an airline evidence-based training framework before that happens? Should we not begin to look at it much earlier in the training pipeline?
So if I could summarise, obviously the industry will continue to face these challenges going forward, and if anything, it might accelerate even more so. So that challenge that the industry will face is about how do we set the pilots up for success from the start in preparation for that command in an earlier time frame. So you argue that the traditional phase-based training model is no longer sufficient. Where is it breaking down and what do you see as the risks that it creates?
Yeah, so the issue is traditionally there were these different phases in airline training have been around for a long time, and they were developed for different reasons over the last 30 or 40 years. So each of these phases, the Ab Initio primary flight training to a commercial pilot license and instrument rating, was developed at one point in time to serve one market, and then we needed people to bridge the sort of gap between where the traditional CPL left off. So we built the multi-crew cooperation training because when the first 200 hours we taught you to fly alone, we better teach you to fly with somebody else now. That brought about MCC, because without that you weren't quite ready to go in for what is normally quite a compressed aircraft specific training course in the aircraft type rating course. And then you join the airline and the burden is on the airline to try and make sure all this comes together in an airline environment and the operator's conversion course. But each of these four phases tends, because they were developed at different points in time, trying to bridge in effect the shortcomings in the phase previous, were built with different design philosophies, were never built with the data stream in mind, and it didn't allow visibility of pilot development all through these different phases. And once you begin to have different players provide each of these different parts of the training, there is an obvious danger that something drops between the gaps as they progress from phase to phase. And that's something that I think most airline managers would recognize.
Yeah, very, very wise words. Just building on your session again, your session talks about an integrated pilot supply system. What does that look like in practice and how is it different from today's model?
I think fundamentally you take this competency-based training and assessment approach of building an adapted competency model. What does a pilot need to do at the end of this training journey? You break it down into logical milestones, mini milestones within phases, but always you're going back to, you know what the end will look like right at the very first lesson, the very first primary flight training lesson, or even earlier than that in theoretical knowledge training. We begin to introduce the airline pilot competency model. We begin to introduce aspects of pilot competencies and observable behaviors really early in the piece, and where it normally flows through and is allowed to develop as we introduce more and more complex tasks and in more and more complex environments. The airline pilot slowly begins to develop over a period of 18 months to 2 years, as opposed to doing a single pilot job for about 12, 14 months, and all of a sudden adding bolt-ons and beginning to talk about competencies at the end. So in a nutshell, it is taking the adapted competency model concept from competency-based training assessment, applying it throughout the entire training design spectrum, right from ground school all the way through the various phases.
Sounds very intriguing. So, Chris, if organisations could prioritise one change today, what advice or what should it be that you'd give them?
Look, if I'm looking to the airline manager hat on, and an airline manager that does not control a cadet pilot training pathway as closely as perhaps Qantas or other airlines that are fortunate enough to have a flight school of their own can do, my suggestion is to sit down with one or more of your providers that are providing ab initio training and say, well, this is the airline X end product, and we would like to see some traditional, some competency-based training and assessment design go through the entire pilot training life cycle. I would begin to talk about observable behaviors related to threat and error management, decision making, workload management, even in the single pilot environment as an ab initio training. And then as we introduce them to multi-crew ops, begin to talk about leadership and teamwork in that concept, even in a light twin or even role playing in tabletop loft. But fundamentally introduce the pilot competencies and observable behaviors relevant to the phase of training, but right from day one. That should be a starting point for this change.
Very wise words, Chris. My sincere thanks for catching up today. We're looking forward to having you speak in both the pilot and the ATO streams up there, with your session titled From Training Provider to Pilot Supply Stream, Integrating CBTA from Ab Initio to Airline Operations. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Adrian.